After a turbulent G7 summit abroad, US President Donald Trump faces political headwinds at home. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Trump has returned from a contentious meeting with world leaders to more challenges. The US-China trade war shows no immediate signs of easing, and with Iran's president saying talks with Washington are off the table, tensions remain high with Tehran. All this casting a shadow on the 2020 US presidential election. There's much to talk about. I want to bring in our panel. Hamza Khan is a democratic strategist and founder of the Pluralism Project. He joins us right here in our studio. Van Mobley joins us from Milwaukee in Wisconsin. He's professor of history and economics at Concordia University. Joining us from Des Moines, Iowa, David Skidmore is political science professor at Drake University. And CGTN White House Correspondent Nathan King joins us right here on the set. Welcome to all of you. Nathan, let me start with you. So the G7's over. Trade was a big issue. They also talked about Iran as well. In fact, the French president invited the Iranian foreign minister to Biarritz, where the G7 took place. President Trump says he's open to the idea of new negotiations with Iran over the nuclear issue. But overnight, the Iranian president said those talks are off the table unless sanctions are lifted. Let's watch.
Lift the sanctions. All the sanctions against the Iranian nation, which are illegal, cruel, and wrong, should be lifted. If you lift all these sanctions, and if you bow your head to the nation of Iran, well, then the situation would be different.
So where does it go to from here?
Yeah, that was a diplomatic overture by Emmanuel Macron. Some consternation in the White House that he did that, although Trump said that he was informed every step of the way about Javad Zarif coming to the G7 in the southwest of France. Basically, this was a way of trying to break an impossible deadlock in a way, because you have the maximum pressure campaign from Washington, but you have the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians saying they're committed to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and want to basically deliver economic terms to Iran that were agreed. But of course you have secondary sanctions by the US that basically blocks the sale of Iranian oil and makes it very, very difficult. And we've seen those tensions, haven't we, build up. This was the way, and France, by the way, was one of the most hawkish signatories of the Iran nuclear deal. So they can play a good officer in between Washington and Tehran. But it's failed to gain momentum. You know, this maximum pressure campaign is very much not necessarily Trump's design, but the people around him. We're talking about the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, others. And it's not just Iran, is it? We're seeing it in Venezuela. We're seeing it when it comes to the trade talks as well. Maximum pressure may not be working, but it's the policy of the day. The question is it going to work? And we have seen Iranian rhetoric and also Iranian defiance basically standing up to it. The country's government has not collapsed. There are economic problems, but in the region, it feels that it's still very much relevant and has enough friends around the world to weather the storm. So we'll wait and see. The talk in Washington was about a possible meeting between Rouhani and President Trump at the UN General Assembly coming up in September, you know, the big global gathering. That's usually a good place to do it, but it looks like that's off the table. Now, Rouhani did say all the sanctions have to go first. There is potentially some wiggle room if some sanctions were freezing. If Iran, for example, said, we could talk not just about nuclear issues, but maybe ballistic missiles as well. There has been some talk of that, but you can tell from the rhetoric that is not there yet.
All right, let me bring in David Skidmore. David, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, if you listen to that statement there from the Iranian president, it seems like the Iranians are playing hardball here, saying, this is our condition if you want talks to take place. You've got to remove sanctions first. I mean, is the United States under any kind of pressure to negotiate right now?
Well, we know that the president believes himself to be the ultimate negotiator. He believes in personal diplomacy. If he can get in the room with someone, he thinks he can sway them. We've seen that in his negotiations with North Korea. But of course, international diplomacy is about national interests, not about personalities. And so you have to lay the groundwork. There has to be some meeting of the minds in terms of interests, and it's not clear that that groundwork has been laid here.
Hamza, as
could I jump in
go
there
ahead,
for just
go
a
ahead.
moment?
Yes, please, go ahead.
I believe that President Macron stated and echoed President Trump's demand that the Iranian regime never have nuclear weapons. But he is open to dialogue. He remains open to dialogue, and he's very well-meaning for the Iranian people. I think that if the Iranian regime would simply come to the table and we could have some dialogue, things would work out very nicely for everyone.
Are you optimistic with this, Van Mobley, the fact that the president did say that he is open to negotiations?
Yes, I'm optimistic, and I think that eventually we'll get there. I'm very optimistic.
Okay.
Sorry, I just want to. The problem is here, what's the end game? And we're seeing this a lot in Trump diplomacy, where he's very willing to meet, and I think it's actually refreshing that he sits down with Kim Jong-un and other leaders, because you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Right. And I think it's really good. But the problem is that you don't see what the end game is in any of this. The strategy isn't well laid out. You know what I mean? So there's nothing to build these sort of cycles of trust, for example, that you need to get where you want to go.
Right. Hamza, I want to get back to a point that Nathan talked about earlier on, and that was the fact that the White House was not happy with the fact that Javad Zarif was invited to Biarritz to the G7 meeting. What kind of message do you think that sent to President Trump? I mean, let's not forget that the United States has imposed sanctions, personal sanctions on Zarif himself.
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think it speaks ill of our relationships overall with our allies across the world, but it does speak about the level to which our allies' leadership do not trust Donald Trump to execute American foreign policy in the best interest of both the United States and its outstanding treaty obligations across the world. So, if anything, having Foreign Minister Zarif there sent the message that, look, we're going to be working with Iran regardless of Mr. Trump engaging or not, or whatever Queen-style brawling he thinks is the appropriate message to be sending across the world. And it also is a way of showing the rest of the world that Iran can be brought into the fold, whereas the United States is continuing to isolate itself with Mr. Trump's rhetoric. It's clear that Iran, on the other hand, can be brought in.
I would simply disagree with that. I would simply note that President Macron is the leader of France, which is a great nation that Donald Trump loves, cares for, America's oldest ally, and President Macron makes his own decisions, and he still works with Donald Trump. And so I think that they have a very good, strong relationship, one in which they can air differences.
But what about the point, Van, that the message here that is being sent to President Trump is that we're not going to abide by the conditions that you have placed on us. We're going to continue to talk with the Iranians, try and get the JCPOA back on track.
Well, I think that they're trying to get dialogue, which is what President Trump has called for. So I'm optimistic, and I see France is an old ally, America's oldest ally, and they remain an old ally.
Just because you're an old ally doesn't mean you don't disagree with your friends in close quarters, and that's clearly what's going on here. There's no greater rebuke that an ally and a friend can send than to invite someone to a party that you don't have a good relationship with, knowing that everyone else in the room does have some sort of relationship and does want to see some sort of dialogue happen. So I have to disagree with the professor here. It's very clear that the message being sent to us by our allies is that, look, Mr. Trump, you need to get yourself under control. You really need to get your message under control and focus on what's in the best interest of the world. And clearly, your style of brawling with people in public and tweeting for diplomacy hasn't worked so far.
Okay, Van Mobley, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that before I move on to the trade issue.
I think that the Donald Trump style works very well. One of the key components that he ran on was to renegotiate NAFTA, which is not an easy task, and I think he's been quite successful, and would call upon Nancy Pelosi to pass the USMCA, put it on the floor, and it'll go.
All right, Nathan, let's move.
Talking of trade.
Yeah, talking of trade, let's move on to the trade war between the United States and China. President Trump says that China is, in his words, very keen to strike a deal. They really want to strike a deal, but the U.S. is holding out for a better deal. I guess the message that the president is sending there is that, they want it more than we do.
Well, I mean, the mixed messaging was just incredible. We basically got, sorry to quote Alexander Dumas, we were in France. It was the tale of two Trumps, not the tale of two cities, where basically on Friday he was lashing out on Twitter, raised tariffs on Twitter, had some bad things to say about his own central banker. It was quite incredible. And then we had diplomatic Trump over the weekend saying he had second thoughts, although he said, the White House said it was misquoted, praising President Xi all over again. We've seen this before. It's this made for TV, made for Twitter sound bites that create this huge whiplash. It's a word that's been used a lot in the press in the last couple of days, and it's very apt. The question is, does it move the needle on the trade talks? And the answer is no, because essentially what you've got is a load of tariffs coming in September, the delayed ones coming in the middle of December. He's just retro-upped the ones that are already in place, if we can take him at his word, which is, doubtable. And then he was scrambling to say, well, we've had phone calls which we could disprove in 10 minutes, because we know when the phone calls happened. All the media did that, and then they latched on to Liu He, the chief economic negotiator, who made just a restatement of policy, which, saying we should do it in a calm and considered way, and said, you see, calm and considered, we're back on track. The big question, of course, is are we going to have talks here in Washington in September? That has been the question now for a while. Are we going to see progress? He's already raised tariffs twice since the talk of those talks. So we'll wait and see. But China has not signed on to any of that. So that's worrying too, because, with all the G7 focus on the downturn in the global economy, talk is fine, but you can't talk up the global economy. At least maybe a blip in the stock market for 10 minutes, but not the global economy.
David Skidmore, what do you make of
here in Iowa?
Go ahead.
If I could say something about here in Iowa, farmers have been patiently waiting for some resolution, and they feel like Charlie Brown with Lucy pulling away the football, because a number of times there have been indications from the White House that a deal was coming, and all of a sudden the talks break down. The rural areas of Iowa are deep red. It takes a lot for folks to lose faith in a Republican president. But especially with this latest escalation, farmers are hurting not just from the loss of an enormous market for soybeans in the world's most populous country, but also the flooding in the spring, the president's policies on ethanol, which have hurt farmers as well. And so patience is rapidly running out. And this is a state that
I will get to you, Van.
Trump won.
Right. Van Mobley, this trade issue is becoming a major challenge for the president domestically. U.S. farmers are beginning to feel the pain. Here's the president of the U.S. Farmers Union, Roger Johnson, speaking about this. Let's watch this.
But instead of looking to solve existing problems in our agricultural sector, it seems this administration has just created new ones. Between burning bridges with all of our biggest trading partners and undermining our domestic biofuels industry, President Trump is making things worse, not better.
Wow.
So, Van Mobley, I mean, that's a very forceful statement there. It's very clear he's lost the support of farmers.
Well, I think that he doesn't speak for all farmers.
Well, he's the head of the farmers union.
He's the biggest corn-growing state in the union. But
I would simply point out that the farmers will stick with Trump, and they also know that the USMCA opens up large markets, for example, for dairy, and that's in Canada. And I would simply point out that at the G7, they announced a new deal with Japan, where Japan will be buying large amounts of American agricultural products. So I think that Trump is working hard, and he's being successful, and he is supporting them when necessary, and he's said that, and he's done it, and he'll continue to do it. And I would simply point out that there are lots of other things that cause commodities to fluctuate on the global market, which the farmers know very well. And all of this could, about low prices, for example, could change very quickly if we had an early frost.
All right, go ahead, Nathan.
It's the difference between talking.
I'll get you, David. I'll get you. Go ahead, Nathan.
It's the difference between talking points and actually what's going on in the ground. You don't get the head of the Iowa Farmers Association talking unless it's really, really, really serious.
It's actually the U.S. Farmers
Union. It's the National Farmers Union. That's what I was going to jump on right there.
Sorry, in Iowa. USMCA does open up markets, but only a little bit of the dairy market in Canada. You read it; it's about 2 or 3%.
Right.
The deal with Japan, which is wildly unpopular right now in Japan, because they basically think that they've given away something without a guarantee that there won't be auto tariffs.
Right.
That is going to be almost dead on arrival unless there's some changes. And actually, it gives more to the US than it would have done with TPP without Japan getting something back. They are not going to open their floodgates now. American beef and American corn, that is just Japan.
Okay.
So what the biggest markets are essentially China. China, unfortunately for the Trump administration, has 1.3 billion people and they love soybeans, and there is no market to replace it. Right. So any talk of how much he loves the farmers, he's still, whatever his policies, and a lot of people agree with what he's doing, but it's the way he's doing it could lose him votes. Now, Iowa is the caucus state. Remember that?
Yeah.
So if he's challenged in a primary, that could be a time for Iowa farmers to turn around and say, you know, a protest vote. He's probably going to win the nomination, but that could be a protest vote, and that is a big problem.
They're not likely to vote for a Democrat in 2020.
Right, no, the primary.
They can stay home. They can stay home.
He's primary.
And the president's net favorability ratings in Wisconsin and in Iowa have fallen by 20 points since 2016 election. So he's losing the Midwest.
Hamza, you wanted to say something?
Well, I simply
one moment, Mobley. I'll get to you in a moment. Go ahead.
So I was just going to jump in and say that, you know, again, going back to talking points and whatnot, when we had the National Farmers Union coming out and making it clear that President Trump is hurting farmers, that's something to keep in mind when you have a market of 1.3 billion people for soy versus 25 million people in Canada. I mean, that's something to keep in mind as well. But at the end of the day, when we're looking at this electorally, we're looking at the Midwest and the Southwest and other parts of America, it's becoming clear that the Republicans are now playing defense in states that they're supposed to be winning very easily.
Yeah, but David Skidmore makes a point that these farmers may not like Trump, but they're not going to vote for a Democrat, are they?
It doesn't take every single farmer in Iowa to flip the state. That's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing is that we don't have to win Iowa. We don't have to win any of these states. As Democrats, the main objective needs to be to put the Republicans on defense for Congress in those states. If we can take back the Senate, if we can win a couple more seats in the House, it's a win. It's a payday for us anyway, and that's really the game plan for us at this point.
Go ahead, Van Mobley.
Well, I would just simply say that once again, Hamza, I'm sure that they have their strategy, and the Democrats have their strategy, and President Trump and the Republicans have our own. And I would simply say we're on the offense ourselves, and we're going to take away a lot of Hispanic votes because Trump has done a good job for them, and African Americans.
I don't believe that's true at all. I don't believe you're going to win on the Latino community. These are great talking points. I want to get this clear. These are great talking points if you're in the spin room on Fox or in the spin room on CNN. But here we're trying to do real news tonight. And what I think is really the case here is that at the end of the day, these communities are turning against the Republican Party in a way that hasn't been seen in over a generation.
Right.
You know, Donald Trump's statement last election, what do you have to lose? African-American voters get behind me. African-American voters are going, yeah, we have a lot to lose, including the country we live in.
Yeah.
So that's really what's going on. I do not think that we're going to see any minority push towards the Republican Party for possibly the next generation.
I mean, it's about the economy, stupid, isn't it? And, you know, the one great thing that Trump has been able to do is continue this fantastic expansion that the U.S. has had since the depths of the worst worst recession since the Depression of the 1930s.
Well, that was true. That was true until now, until March.
Well, exactly. And this is a tipping point. We have seen U.S. manufacturing contract for the first time since 2009. Right. We are seeing business investment slow.
Right.
There is a feeling on Wall Street, and you can feel it, that the business cycle is going to turn. Is that going to be a small dip, or is it going to be a big dip? But it could come before, most likely it could come before the next election.
Okay, Hamza, I'll get to you in a moment. David Skidmore, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Well, that manufacturing also hits the Midwest, which is you know, blue collar. So, but you know, we flipped. The Democrats flipped 2 Republican seats in the Congress in the last election. Steve King, who typically had won by 20 points, just barely slipped back into office with a 3-point lead. So, yeah, this is not a good period for the Republicans here in the Midwest.
And Democrats actually picked up more seats in this past election than we did in the wake of Watergate. That's something to keep in mind in the House.
40 seats, yeah.
That's right. And then another thing to add in is that we haven't talked yet about the yield curve inversion that we've seen for the last 2 quarters, and that's something to keep in mind because that has been for the last 5 or 6 decades the defining characteristic of having a recession within the next 5 or 6 quarters. So I think that we're looking at the collapse of the Republican Party in real time. I think that we're going to see a splintering in the conservative movement. We'll talk about the Democrats and their situation later.
We're going to get to
them
next.
A lot going on there.
Okay, Van Mobley, go ahead. I want to move on to the Democratic nomination battle, but you wanted to say something.
Certainly, I would simply say that this is the longest expansion, really, that we've had post World War II. It's lasted a very long time.
President Obama.
And I actually I believe that the tariffs are actually keeping it propped up. They're not causing it to collapse. And I expect that we've had a little slowdown, but and when the Fed does what it needs to do, if they would do it a little bit quicker, then this would be even less of a speed bump.
Okay, Nathan, let's talk about the nomination battle in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden was the leader for a long time. Now he's been caught up by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, it's horrible to be a front runner early in the race, right? You never want to be the guy out.
Especially early on. Yeah.
Especially early on. And, this is a very crowded field. And, I'm going to say no one knows. Because I remember what happened to us last election. So on the other side with the Republicans. So, no one knows. But Joe Biden has not been as impressive as people thought he would going to be.
Putting it mildly.
Yeah. And, maybe he's taking time to warm up. Maybe, he says it's a process or all this sort of stuff. But what has surprised a lot of people is how strong Elizabeth Warren has been.
Right.
Bernie Sanders could have clinched the nomination against the Hillary Clinton machine, didn't do that. But Elizabeth Warren has been remarkable. Now, regardless of whether you agree with her or not, she's organizing, she's fundraising, she's going around the country, has huge amounts of energy. Her message is, I've got a plan for that, I've got a plan for that, I've got a plan for that. And, the big question is the Democratic Party ready to nominate someone who is considered left? She says she's a capitalist, but a lot of ideas are pretty to the left in American politics. Or do they go for some sort of centrist? And I think we don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay, David Skidmore, one of the words we hear very often when we talk about the Democratic field is electability, that Joe Biden is the one who can be elected, not the others. But looking at the latest polls, I mean, do you think Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders also qualify for that term, electability?
Well, here in Iowa, Elizabeth Warren has been surging. There's a lot of enthusiasm. Her crowd sizes are great. Buttigieg and Kamala Harris had moments earlier in the summer, but they quickly faded back into the scenery. She's taking votes both away from Sanders and from Biden. Biden is a couple problems that he has. One is that he's prematurely going into general election mode. So his case for himself has simply been, I can beat Donald Trump because I'm in the middle. He's not putting out policy proposals. He's not putting out a vision for the future. It's more, we're going to go back to the Obama years because, I was the vice president then. The other thing is that, he's always been a gaffe machine, but in the past, people said, well, that's just Joe. Now they're saying, I wonder if Joe's, too far along, a little, too old for this. So when you get to a certain age, people start looking at those things differently.
I want to jump in here.
Yeah, but it's a great point that David makes that Joe Biden has presumed that I'm the nominee and I'm not fighting the general election.
All right, so let's go back to a couple of things. First of all of the top 3 candidates who are shining right now, there's one thing in common. They're all authentic. Same thing with Elizabeth Warren, same thing with Bernie Sanders, same thing with Joe Biden. You can call Uncle Joe anything you want. You can say he's a gaffe machine. The truth of the matter is that he's an authentic man. He has nothing left to prove. He's lost a daughter and a wife in a car accident. He had a son die from cancer. He's been vice president to the most popular president in American history for 8 years. What does he have left to do to prove to anyone, including himself? Nothing. He's putting himself out there as a public servant, and I think that's still resonating with a lot of folks. That's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing when it comes to Elizabeth Sanders and Bernie Sanders,
but what's different this time? He's run for election before, Joe Biden. He's never been nominee.
So, what's different this time around is that in terms of him closing up his his offerings for the public in terms of his ideas, is that when you're the front runner, it's better to kind of like, shut up and say less than say more and get yourself in trouble. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders both have the ability right now to win over the soft support that was backing Joe Biden by default, because everyone was going, yeah, maybe Joe should have ran last time instead of Hillary Clinton. Those folks are switching over right now to Sanders and Warren. But I do believe that at the end of the day, with these three candidates, we don't know who's going to win. But we do know for a fact that all three of them have a real message, and it's resounding with the public. And in terms of electability, I don't think you go wrong with any three of them. They might be to the left, to the right. I think Americans are beyond the shock and awe politics now of having the glitz and glam. We tried that with Donald Trump. Causing all this brawling, but I think now people want someone who can deliver.
As you said, Democrats
So I was a
40
caucus
seats,
David.
right?
Yeah.
Took 40 seats in the midterm elections. They won those, not in left-leaning districts. They won them in purple states,
Right.
Purple districts. Like, for example, women who were fed up with sort of the stuff that Trump said. So if the party moves to the left, that's a bit of a problem when it comes to the general election.
All right, I want to talk about...
But by default, those folks are going to vote for a Democrat over Donald Trump any day, right?
Very
We still got them in the presidency.
All right, very quickly, David, then I want to get to Van Mobley. Go ahead, David.
So remember that Iowa is a caucus. That means only about 10% of the electorate actually turns out for caucuses. That means you're looking at people who are activists, not average Democrats. And so it's impossible to do well by sitting back and having a front runner role. You've got to get out and do retail politics here and get the activists out, and Warren's doing that and Biden's not.
All right, Van Mobley, let's look at the Republican side. It looks like President Trump is going to face some challenges for the nomination. One is the former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, and now Joe Walsh has been talking a lot about this. He's a radio talk show host, former lawmaker. This is what he had to say. Let's listen to this.
I have been waiting every single day this year for somebody to step up, a Republican to step up to make the moral case against him, that he is unfit. I wrote that op-ed in the New York Times 2-3 weeks ago. The guy's unfit. Come on, somebody should challenge him, and I apologize for my role in helping to elect him. Nobody stepped up, Allison, and if we don't, I realized this past week, the Republican Party is going to regret it, but the country will be in danger.
Very quickly, Van Mobley, I have 1 minute. What do you make of that?
I think that I have trouble even remembering his name. Donald Trump will be the nominee. And then I would also point out that we'll see how moral Warren, Sanders, and Biden are now that they're evenly matched, and they're going to start cutting each other up pretty badly, I think.
He looks more presidential than the guy we've got right now, I'll tell you that. And I like his talking points, and he's right. The Republican Party is going to regret it. The country's in danger. And I don't know what his chances are, but I think it's worthwhile for us to consider the fact that, Walsh might be the saving grace of the Republican Party. There's still decent men and women who are in it.
Or a stalking horse for someone else.
We have the next Democratic debate coming up in about 3 weeks. Is that going to be a make or break debate for Joe Biden?
I don't think it's a make or break for Joe Biden. I think he's in it for the long haul, and I think he'll do fine either way. But I do think it's a make or break for Kamala Harris. She got herself in a lot of trouble with Tulsi Gabbard, which no one really expected. I mean, Kamala has a lot of secrets that are just coming to light now, a lot of skeletons in the closet, and we'll see if she can survive this.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.